The air was thick with tension as the sound of boots crunching on gravel echoed through the dimly lit train yard. "You think you're something special, huh?" the officer sneered, his voice laced with disdain. The woman stood tall, her gaze steady despite the fear bubbling beneath her calm exterior. "People like you don't belong in places like this. You're nothing. Just another nobody pretending to matter." She didn't flinch, but her silence only fueled his anger. He grabbed her arm roughly, forcing her to her knees. "Answer me," he barked. Still, she refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. The hatred in his eyes burned brighter. To him, this was power, dominance, the ability to strip someone of their dignity without consequence. It started with a simple accusation. She had been waiting at the platform when he singled her out. No reason, no cause, just the color of her skin and the quiet confidence she carried. "Show me your ID," he had demanded, his tone sharp and unyielding. When she calmly explained that she didn't have it on her, his demeanor shifted, his eyes narrowing as if he had found a criminal in disguise. "I don't need your excuses," he spat, yanking her by the arm. "You're under arrest." "For what?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "For existing," he shot back coldly, dragging her through the onlookers who averted their gazes, unwilling to intervene. Some murmured quietly, but no one stepped forward. She was alone in this fight. The humiliation continued as he shoved her into the back of his patrol car, driving her to a secluded part of the rail yard. The darkness of the area mirrored the darkness in his actions. As they arrived, the officer pulled her out with unnecessary force, the metallic clinking of handcuffs echoing in the night air. "This is what happens to people like you when they don't know their place," he said, his words sharp and deliberate. He forced her to the ground near the tracks, tying her hands with industrial-strength zip ties. She struggled, but his strength, and his weapon, kept her at bay. "Why are you doing this?" she finally asked, her voice breaking, a crack in her otherwise composed facade. He leaned in close, his breath hot and filled with venom. "Because I can. And no one's going to stop me." The rumble of an approaching train grew louder in the distance, the faint glow of its headlights piercing through the darkness. Panic gripped her, but she fought to maintain her composure. She wasn't just a victim, she was something more. Something he couldn't see. The train horn blared, and for a brief moment, a flicker of fear crossed her face. It was all the satisfaction he needed. "There it is," he said smugly, stepping back and crossing his arms. "Let's see how far that attitude of yours gets you now." What he didn't realize, what he couldn't comprehend, was that this moment wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The woman had faced injustices before, but this one carried a weight she hadn't encountered until now. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every silent witness, every person who had been in her shoes and walked away with scars. As the train barreled closer, something shifted. Her fear turned into resolve. Her silence became louder than his threats. And in the background, the universe seemed to prepare for a reckoning he couldn't escape. But what happened next would turn the world upside down. The officer thought he held all the cards, that he was untouchable. But as the dawn approached and the truth unraveled, his power crumbled piece by piece. What he didn't know, what he couldn't imagine, was the storm heading his way, a storm that would expose everything he stood for and strip him of the very power he abused. Who was this woman, really? And how could one night, one act of hatred, bring his entire world crashing down? Stay until the end. This isn't just a story about vengeance. It's about justice, courage, and a twist you'll never see coming. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, prejudice, and injustice in any form. To our Black audience, we see you, we support you, and we're committed to telling stories that amplify voices and reflect the resilience and power within your community. This channel believes in creating awareness and inspiring change through impactful storytelling. Now, let's dive into today's tale, a story of justice, resilience, and the ultimate twist. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay updated on every gripping story we bring. Enjoy the journey ahead. The morning sun rose over the small town of Greenwood, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. It was a town where everyone seemed to know everyone, a picturesque facade hiding the cracks of deep-seated divisions. The streets were quiet at this hour, with only the occasional sound of a car passing by or a shopkeeper preparing for the day ahead. It was in this town, seemingly ordinary yet layered with complexities, that two lives were about to collide. Angela Carter was a woman of quiet strength. In her late 30s, she had built a career through sheer determination and a fierce sense of justice. Growing up in Greenwood wasn't easy for someone like her, but Angela was never one to be deterred by obstacles. She had been raised by her grandmother, a no-nonsense woman who worked as a maid for one of the wealthier families in town. Angela learned early on that the world wasn't fair, but her grandmother's lessons instilled in her a belief that she could change things if she worked hard enough. Years of studying and sacrifice had paid off when Angela joined the police academy. She was driven not by a desire for authority but by a deep-seated need to make her community safer and more just. Her path wasn't smooth. Being one of the few black women in law enforcement meant constant scrutiny, both from her colleagues and the community. Yet Angela persisted, rising through the ranks with an unyielding focus. Her work ethic and sharp instincts eventually earned her a reputation as one of the most competent officers in the state. Angela had recently returned to Greenwood after spending a decade in larger cities. The town had changed in some ways but remained the same in others. Her new role as head of the local police department was an opportunity she took with pride and trepidation. Greenwood's law enforcement history was marred with corruption and prejudice, and Angela knew she had her work cut out for her. Yet, she was determined to lead by example, to prove that integrity could prevail even in the most challenging environments. Across town, Officer Daniel Hayes was beginning his day. Hayes was a man in his mid-40s with a career that spanned over 2 decades. To the casual observer, he was the picture of a devoted officer, always in uniform, patrolling the streets, and enforcing the law with an almost obsessive zeal. But beneath the surface, Hayes harbored a darker side. Raised in a family steeped in tradition, he grew up in a household that viewed change as a threat. His father had been a police officer too, and Hayes followed in his footsteps, adopting the same rigid worldview. For Hayes, the badge was more than a symbol of authority, it was a shield that justified his actions, no matter how questionable. He believed in order and control, often confusing those concepts with dominance and prejudice. Over the years, his colleagues noticed his harsh treatment of certain community members, but the culture of silence within the department allowed him to continue unchecked. Greenwood was his town, and Hayes considered it his duty to maintain it the way he saw fit. The day their paths crossed began like any other. Angela was reviewing reports in her modest office at the station, her mind already racing with ideas for reforms. She had plans to implement bias training, community outreach programs, and stricter accountability measures. But change was never easy, and resistance from within the department was palpable. Many officers resented her presence, seeing her as an outsider despite her roots in Greenwood. Hayes, meanwhile, was patrolling the train station, a place he frequented under the guise of maintaining security. To him, the station was a microcosm of the town, a place where he could assert his authority. It was here that he spotted Angela. Dressed in casual attire, she was waiting for a friend arriving from out of town. Hayes didn't recognize her. She wasn't in uniform, and he had yet to meet his new boss. To Hayes, Angela was just another face, another target to scrutinize. He approached her with the air of someone accustomed to having his commands obeyed. "Ma'am, may I see your ID?" he asked, his tone firm but condescending. Angela looked up, surprised by the sudden interruption. "Excuse me. Is there a problem, officer?" "I'm asking the questions here," Hayes replied, his eyes narrowing. "Let me see your ID." Angela hesitated, confused by his aggressive demeanor. I'm not sure why that's necessary. I'm just here to pick someone up. Hayes didn't like her calmness. To him, it felt like defiance. I won't ask again, he said, his voice rising. Show me your ID, or we're going to have a problem. Angela's instinct was to de-escalate, but she also knew her rights. Officer, with all due respect, I don't believe I've done anything to warrant this treatment. Hayes' patience snapped. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm and unforgiving. That's enough. Turn around. You're coming with me. What are you doing? Angela asked, her voice rising in disbelief. This is unnecessary. But Hayes wasn't listening. To him, this was about control, about putting her in her place. He radioed in a vague report about a suspicious individual and escorted Angela to his patrol car. The onlookers at the station exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. Angela was taken to a secluded part of the rail yard, her protests falling on deaf ears. When they arrived, Hayes pulled her out roughly and forced her to sit near the tracks. He tied her hands, ignoring her questions and objections. People like you, he sneered, need to learn that you don't run things around here. Angela stared at him, her composure faltering for the first time. You don't even know who I am, she said quietly, her voice tinged with both fear and defiance. You're nobody, Hayes replied coldly. And you're about to find out what happens when nobodies think they're above the law. The distant sound of an approaching train filled the air, and for the first time, Hayes allowed himself a smirk. He believed he had won. But he was wrong. He didn't know the truth about the woman before him. He didn't know that his actions were setting the stage for a reckoning he could never have anticipated. The rumble of the approaching train grew louder, each second adding weight to the suffocating tension in the air. Angela sat bound, her wrists aching from the zip ties, her mind racing through the whirlwind of emotions, anger, fear, and a sharp resolve cutting through it all. Across from her, Hayes stood with his arms crossed, the faint glow of the train headlights reflecting in his cold, unflinching eyes. You don't even know what you've done, Angela said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. She was buying time, calculating every word as the roar of the train crept closer. Hayes chuckled, his tone laced with mockery. Oh, I know exactly what I've done. I've put another arrogant mouth where it belongs. You think you're special? That you can walk around like this town owes you something? Not anymore. Angela didn't reply immediately. Instead, she looked past him, toward the faint outlines of the rail yard. Her breathing was controlled, but her mind churned. She wasn't just thinking about her immediate survival, she was thinking of what this moment could mean, of the larger picture, the cracks in the system that had allowed someone like Hayes to operate unchecked. The train horn blared, snapping her focus back to the present. It was close now, the vibrations from the rails shaking the ground beneath her. You don't understand, Angela said, her voice low but charged with something Hayes didn't recognize, an undercurrent of power. This won't end the way you think it will. Big words for someone tied to a train track, Hayes sneered. I don't care who you think you are. Out here, you're nothing. Angela caught the faint sound of movement behind Hayes, but she didn't let her gaze betray it. Every fiber of her being urged her to act now, to push through the fear and stall him long enough. She leaned forward slightly, her tone shifting. You've spent your whole life like this, haven't you? Looking for someone to blame. It's not about me, it's about you. Shut up, Hayes snapped, his calm exterior cracking. She pressed on, her words cutting through his composure. You think this makes you strong? That it gives you control? But you're not in control, Hayes. Not anymore. The faint sound behind him grew closer. A shadow moved between the metal beams of the rail yard scaffolding, deliberate but silent. Angela's sharp instincts caught it, and she knew it was her chance, her only chance. She just needed Hayes distracted a moment longer. Do you think people will look the other way this time? She asked, her voice rising. Do you think you're untouchable? I said shut up. Hayes barked, stepping closer to her, his face inches from hers. The train horn screamed, the light bathing them both in a harsh glow. Hayes's hand twitched toward the baton at his hip, a reflex more than a threat. Angela stared back at him, unblinking. You're scared, aren't you? That was the moment the shadow behind him moved. The loud clang of metal striking the ground broke Hayes's focus. He spun around, but it was too late. A figure emerged, one of the rail workers Angela had noticed earlier, a wiry man with a weathered face and sharp eyes. He wielded a long wrench, poised like a weapon. Step away, the man growled, his voice cutting through the chaos like steel. Hayes hesitated, the briefest flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. This doesn't concern you, he said, his hand tightening on the baton. It does now, the man shot back. His gaze flicked to Angela, tied on the ground, then back to Hayes. Untie her. Now. Hayes laughed, but there was a strain to it, a crack in his facade. You don't know who you're dealing with. And you don't know what you're doing, the man countered, stepping closer. The wrench in his hand glinted under the floodlights. You think you're the law here? Not tonight, you're not. The train was dangerously close now, its brakes screeching as the conductor spotted the figures on the track. Angela felt the ground shake beneath her and twisted against the zip ties, her wrists raw from the effort. Her voice cut through the standoff. Get me off these tracks, or you'll regret it. Hayes turned back to her, his face twisted with fury. He pulled the baton from his belt, stepping forward with reckless abandon. But the rail worker wasn't bluffing, he swung the wrench with precision, striking Hayes's arm and sending the baton clattering to the ground. Hayes stumbled, clutching his arm in pain, and the rail worker didn't hesitate. He grabbed a utility knife from his belt, dropped to his knees beside Angela, and sliced through the zip ties. Run, he said firmly. Angela didn't waste a second. She scrambled to her feet, the train now mere yards away. The rail worker pulled her off the track just as the locomotive thundered past, the force of its passage knocking them both to the ground. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the fading sound of the train and the heavy breathing of all three figures. Hayes staggered to his feet, his face a mask of rage. You've made a mistake, he hissed, pointing a shaking finger at Angela. Both of you. Angela straightened, her wrists still burning from the ties. But her eyes were steady, her voice unwavering. No, Hayes. The mistake was yours. The rail worker stood beside her, his wrench still in hand. Hayes looked at them both, the weight of what had just happened starting to sink in. But the fire in his eyes hadn't dimmed, it burned hotter, fueled by humiliation and a dangerous sense of desperation. You think this is over? Hayes spat, his voice trembling with fury. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Angela stepped closer, her gaze locked on his. Neither do you. As Hayes retreated into the shadows, his threat still echoing in the air, Angela felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel yet, triumph. But it wasn't over, not yet. The reckoning was coming, and it would shake the foundation of everything Hayes thought he controlled. The rail worker turned to her, his expression unreadable. You gonna be okay? Angela nodded, her voice steady. I will be. But this isn't finished. And as she walked away from the tracks, her heart pounding with adrenaline and purpose, she knew the real battle was just beginning. The station's fluorescent lights flickered faintly as Angela entered the precinct, her stride measured but unrelenting. She had been here countless times before, but tonight, it felt different. The air was heavier, charged with anticipation. Officers milled about, their conversations muted as she passed. They avoided her gaze, some out of discomfort, others out of guilt. The weight of her presence tonight wasn't something they could ignore. Not anymore. Angela's wrists still bore faint red marks from the zip ties Hayes had used to bind her. She felt the sting every time she flexed her hands, but it only served as a reminder of what was at stake. Tonight wasn't about vengeance, it was about justice, about exposing the rot that had festered in the department for far too long. Inside the chief's office, a small group was already gathered. Captain Miller, a stout man with thinning hair, stood near the window, nervously sipping his coffee. Next to him was Detective Sarah Quinn, one of the few officers Angela trusted implicitly. Her sharp eyes darted toward Angela as she entered, silently asking if she was ready. Angela gave a subtle nod. And then there was Hayes. He sat at the far end of the table, his posture stiff, his jaw clenched. The tension radiating from him was almost palpable. He hadn't expected this, a meeting called so suddenly, so deliberately. His eyes met Angela's for a brief moment, and she saw it, a flicker of unease beneath the bravado. "Thank you all for being here," Angela began, her voice steady, commanding. She didn't sit. She needed to stand, to occupy the room fully. "I've called this meeting to address a matter of grave importance, a matter that concerns not only this department but the integrity of the law we're sworn to uphold." Hayes scoffed audibly, leaning back in his chair. "This sounds like a lecture," he muttered. "Can we skip to the part where you tell us what this is really about?" Angela's eyes narrowed, but she didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she opened a file she had placed on the table. "Yesterday evening, I was unlawfully detained, assaulted, and left in a situation that could have cost me my life." The room fell silent. Even Captain Miller stopped fidgeting, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. Hayes's expression hardened, a faint sheen of sweat visible on his temple. "I don't need to recount the details," Angela continued, her gaze unwavering. "The facts speak for themselves. But what matters most here isn't just what happened to me, it's what it represents. A pattern of abuse, a culture of impunity, and the failure of leadership to hold individuals accountable." "This is ridiculous," Hayes interrupted, his voice rising. "You're making baseless accusations. You think you can just come in here and smear my name without proof?" Angela didn't flinch. She reached into the file and produced a small USB drive, holding it up for the room to see. "Proof?" she repeated, her tone cutting. "I have more than enough." She walked to the room's projector and plugged in the drive. The screen on the wall flickered to life, showing grainy footage of the rail yard from a camera positioned high on a nearby structure. The sound of Hayes's voice filled the room, his venomous words echoing through the silence. "You think you're above the law," the recording blared. "You're nothing. And I'm going to prove it." The color drained from Hayes's face as the footage continued, showing every cruel word, every violent action. The room watched in stunned silence as the events unfolded, culminating in the moment Angela was tied to the tracks. When the video ended, Angela turned to face Hayes directly. "This is who you are," she said, her voice steady but filled with an edge of fury. "This is what you represent. And this ends now." Hayes shot up from his seat, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is entrapment. It's doctored. You set me up." Detective Quinn spoke up, her tone sharp. "The footage came directly from the rail yard security system. It's authentic, and it's damning." "You can't do this to me," Hayes hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "I've given my life to this department. To this town. And what have you taken from it?" Angela countered, stepping closer. "How many lives have you ruined? How many people have you targeted simply because you could? This isn't about one incident, Hayes. This is about a pattern of behavior that stops today." Captain Miller finally found his voice, though it was shaky. "Hayes, this is serious. You need to step back and, I'm not stepping back from anything." Hayes roared, slamming his fist on the table. "She's trying to destroy me, and you're all letting her." Angela held her ground, her voice cutting through the chaos. "You destroyed yourself, Hayes. Your actions, your choices, they brought you here. You thought you were untouchable, but the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface. Hayes's breathing was ragged now, his composure unraveling. He looked around the room, searching for allies, but found none. The weight of his actions, his words, his cruelty, everything was crashing down on him. This isn't over, he spat finally, his voice low and venomous. You'll regret this. Angela didn't respond immediately. She let his words hang in the air, heavy and impotent. Then she stepped forward, meeting his gaze one last time. No, Hayes, she said firmly. It's you who will regret it. 2 officers entered the room then, summoned by Captain Miller. They approached Hayes cautiously, one of them carrying a pair of handcuffs. Daniel Hayes, one of them began, you're under arrest for assault, unlawful detention, and attempted murder. Hayes's face twisted in a mixture of rage and disbelief as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. He struggled briefly but eventually relented, his head hanging low as he was led out of the room. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words. Angela turned to the remaining officers, her gaze sweeping over them. This department will change, she said, her voice resolute. And it starts now. As she walked out of the room, the weight of what had just transpired settled over her. This was only the beginning. There was still so much to rebuild, so much to heal. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that justice could prevail, even in a town like Greenwood. The fluorescent lights of the precinct hallway flickered as Hayes was escorted away, his shoulders hunched, his face pale. Angela watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable, but inside, a storm brewed. This was a victory, but it didn't feel like one, at least not yet. She could still hear the echoes of his venomous words, still feel the sting of every injustice he had inflicted, not just on her but on so many others. This wasn't over. Detective Quinn approached her, her face lined with worry but also a hint of admiration. Are you okay? She asked, her voice low. Angela nodded, though her body betrayed the tension she carried. I will be, she said, her tone measured. But there's more to do. Hayes isn't the only one. Quinn crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. You're right. He's just the symptom of a much bigger disease. The question is, how deep does it go? Angela turned, walking toward her office with Quinn close behind. The other officers in the precinct moved out of their way, some offering fleeting glances of guilt, others of curiosity. Angela didn't acknowledge them. She had spent years fighting for this moment, but she knew the fight wasn't just about Hayes. It was about everything he represented. Inside the office, Angela closed the door behind them. She leaned against her desk, her fingers brushing against the edge of the USB drive still in her hand. Quinn, we need to go through everything, every complaint, every file. If there's a pattern, I want to know about it. Quinn raised an eyebrow, leaning against the wall. You're going to take the entire department apart, aren't you? Angela looked up, her eyes fierce. If that's what it takes to rebuild it, yes. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of their conversation settling between them. Finally, Quinn sighed. You've got my support. But you know it's not going to be easy. There are people here who've looked the other way for years. They're not going to change just because Hayes is gone. Angela's gaze didn't waver. Then they'll go too. A knock on the door interrupted them. Captain Miller stepped inside, his face drawn and hesitant. He glanced between the 2 women before speaking. Angela, we need to talk. Quinn straightened, her posture defensive. Is there a problem, Captain? Miller sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. There's always a problem, Quinn. But this one, it's complicated. Angela motioned for him to continue, her patience thinning. Out with it. Miller hesitated before speaking again. The mayor's office called. Hayes's arrest is already causing waves. There are people who, let's just say, aren't happy with how this is being handled. Angela narrowed her eyes, her voice calm but cold. Let me guess. They're more concerned about the department's reputation than the fact that one of its officers tried to kill me. Miller winced but didn't deny it. Look, Angela, you know how politics work. They're worried about lawsuits, about public perception. Hayes has friends in high places, people who might try to use this against you. Angela stood straighter, her voice sharp. Let them try. I'm not backing down. Miller sighed again, his shoulders sagging. I didn't think you would. Just, be careful. This isn't just about Hayes anymore. As Miller left the room, Quinn turned to Angela, her jaw tight. They're going to fight you every step of the way. I know, Angela replied, her voice unwavering. But they've been fighting people like me for generations. I'm not afraid of them. The door opened again, this time revealing a junior officer, his face pale and nervous. Ma'am, he said, addressing Angela. There's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent. Angela exchanged a glance with Quinn before following the officer out into the precinct lobby. A woman stood there, her posture tense, her hands clutching a folder tightly to her chest. She looked up as Angela approached, her face etched with determination. Chief Carter, the woman said, her voice steady despite the obvious nerves. My name is Maria Vasquez. I need to speak with you. It's about Hayes. Angela's brow furrowed, but she gestured for Maria to follow her back to the office. Once inside, Maria hesitated, her fingers gripping the folder like a lifeline. I don't know how to start, she admitted. Take your time, Angela said, her tone gentle but firm. You're safe here. Maria nodded, taking a deep breath before opening the folder and placing its contents on the desk. Photographs, documents, and handwritten notes spilled out. Angela and Quinn leaned in, their expressions darkening as they examined the evidence. These are records of complaints filed against Hayes, Maria explained. Some of them were mine. Others came from people in the community. But they were all ignored, swept under the rug. I tried to fight it, but I was told to drop it if I wanted to keep my job. Angela's jaw tightened. Who told you that? Maria hesitated before answering. Captain Miller. Quinn's eyes widened, and Angela's stomach churned. She leaned back, her mind racing. This goes deeper than I thought, she muttered. Maria nodded, her voice trembling now. It's not just Hayes. There are others, officers who've protected him, who've covered for him. And it's not just about racism. It's corruption, abuse of power, everything. Angela took a deep breath, steadying herself. Maria, thank you for coming forward. This took courage. Maria shook her head. I'm just tired of being afraid. Angela reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Maria's. You won't have to be anymore. I promise you that. Quinn looked at Angela, her expression a mix of admiration and concern. What now? Angela stood, her resolve hardening. Now, we expose everything. No more secrets. No more silence. The storm brewing in Greenwood wasn't just about Hayes anymore. It was about a system that had thrived on fear and complicity. And Angela Carter was ready to tear it all down. The precinct was quieter now, the tension in the air thick enough to cut through. Angela sat at her desk, her fingers steepled under her chin, the weight of the revelations pressing down on her like an iron shroud. Across from her, Detective Quinn leaned against the filing cabinet, arms crossed, her face unreadable. How deep do you think this goes? Quinn asked, breaking the silence. Angela looked up, her gaze sharp. Deep enough that people like Maria have been silenced for years. Deep enough that Miller is part of it. Hayes isn't the beginning, and he's definitely not the end. Quinn exhaled slowly. Miller was always slippery, but this? I didn't want to believe it. Angela didn't respond immediately. Instead, she picked up one of the documents Maria had left. It was a complaint, typed but unsigned, detailing a series of violent encounters between Hayes and community members. The language was precise, the tone desperate. "Look at this," Angela said, holding it out. Quinn stepped forward, taking the paper. As she read, her lips pressed into a thin line. "They documented everything," Quinn muttered. "And it just disappeared." "Not anymore," Angela said firmly. She stood, pacing the room. "We have to be smart about this. If Miller's involved, that means others are too. We need to secure this evidence and make sure it gets to the right people." Quinn arched an eyebrow. "The right people? You think anyone higher up will actually do something about this? They'll bury it, just like they buried Maria's complaints." Angela stopped pacing, her hands resting on the edge of the desk. "Then we don't give them the chance. We go public." Quinn blinked, her surprise evident. "Public? You mean, a press conference?" Angela nodded. "Exactly. We lay it all out, Hayes, Miller, the systemic cover-ups. Once it's out there, they can't ignore it. The people won't let them." Quinn hesitated. "That's a bold move. You'll make a lot of enemies." Angela's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not here to make friends, Quinn. I'm here to do what's right." Before Quinn could respond, there was a knock at the door. One of the younger officers, Martinez, stepped in, his face pale. "Chief, there's something you need to see." Angela exchanged a glance with Quinn before following Martinez out into the main room. He led them to the bullpen, where a small group of officers was gathered around a television. The local news was on, and the headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen made Angela's stomach drop. "Greenwood Police Chief Under Fire, Internal Scandal Uncovered." The anchor's voice was steady, almost clinical, as she delivered the report. Sources within the Greenwood Police Department claim that Chief Angela Carter has been using her position to target veteran officers, including Daniel Hayes, who was recently arrested on controversial charges. Critics argue that Carter's actions are politically motivated, aimed at dismantling long-standing traditions within the department. Angela clenched her fists. "They're spinning it," she said, her voice low but simmering with anger. Quinn crossed her arms, her expression dark. "Miller must have tipped them off. He's trying to control the narrative before we can." Angela turned to Martinez. "Did they say anything else? Who's their source?" Martinez shook his head. "They didn't name names, but they're painting you as the villain, Chief." The room fell silent, the weight of the situation sinking in. Angela's mind raced. She had expected resistance, but this was a direct attack. They weren't just trying to discredit her, they were trying to destroy her. "Let them," Angela said finally, her voice steady. "Let them throw everything they have at me. Because when this is over, they won't have anything left." Quinn stepped closer, her tone cautious. "Angela, this could backfire. If we push too hard, we don't have a choice," Angela interrupted. "They've controlled the story for too long. It's time we told the truth." As the officers around her exchanged uncertain glances, Angela turned to face them fully. "I know some of you are scared. I know this isn't what you signed up for. But this is our moment, our chance to change things, to make this department something we can all be proud of. I can't do it alone. I need your help." Martinez stepped forward, his posture hesitant but determined. "You have mine, Chief." Slowly, others began to nod, their expressions shifting from uncertainty to resolve. Angela felt a spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Quinn," Angela said, turning to her. "Start drafting the statement. We're holding a press conference tomorrow morning." Quinn nodded. "You got it." As the room began to disperse, Angela stayed behind, staring at the now muted television screen. The image of Hayes's smirking face filled the screen, a stark reminder of the fight ahead. But Angela didn't waver. She had come too far, endured too much, to back down now. The next morning, the precinct parking lot was filled with reporters, their cameras and microphones aimed at the makeshift podium set up near the entrance. Angela stood behind the podium, her shoulders squared, her expression calm but fierce. The sunlight glinted off her badge, a symbol of the authority she had fought so hard to earn. As the crowd quieted, Angela took a deep breath and began. "Good morning. My name is Angela Carter, and I am the chief of police here in Greenwood. Today, I stand before you not just as an officer of the law, but as a member of this community, one that has been failed time and time again by those sworn to protect it." The reporters leaned in, their pens poised, their cameras rolling. Angela didn't falter. For years, this department has operated under a culture of silence and complicity, allowing individuals like Daniel Hayes to abuse their power without consequence. This ends today. I have evidence of systemic corruption, evidence that implicates not just Hayes, but others within this department who have enabled him. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, the tension palpable. I know there are those who will try to discredit me, who will try to paint me as the problem. Let them. I stand here with the truth, and I will not back down. To the people of Greenwood, you deserve better. And I promise you, we will make this right. As she finished, the reporters erupted with questions, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of urgency. Angela stepped back, letting Quinn take over as she moved away from the podium. She felt the weight of the moment, the enormity of what lay ahead. But she also felt something else, hope. For the first time in a long time, she believed that change was possible. The reporters' voices still echoed in the background as Angela stepped away from the podium, her mind focused on the battle that was now fully in motion. Quinn caught up with her, walking briskly to match Angela's purposeful strides toward the precinct doors. "That was one hell of a speech," Quinn said, her tone balancing admiration and concern. "But now they're going to come at you even harder. You know that, right?" Angela stopped at the precinct steps, turning to face Quinn. Her gaze was steady, her resolve unshaken. "Let them. I've spent my entire life fighting battles like this. I'm not stopping now." Before Quinn could respond, Martinez approached, his face pale with urgency. "Chief, we've got a situation. You need to see this." Angela's jaw tightened as she followed him inside, Quinn close on her heels. The precinct's atmosphere was tense, the usual hum of activity replaced by whispers and nervous glances. Martinez led them to the briefing room, where a laptop was set up on the central table. A video played on the screen, paused at an incriminating frame. Angela leaned in, her stomach churning. The video showed her, sitting at her desk, speaking with Maria Vasquez. The audio was clear, and while the words themselves weren't damning, the framing was designed to make it look like Angela was coercing a witness. "Where did this come from?" Angela asked, her voice calm but laced with steel. Martinez hesitated. "It was sent anonymously to a local news station. They aired part of it this morning." Quinn folded her arms, her eyes narrowing. "So, they're trying to make it look like you manipulated Maria into giving her statement." Angela straightened, her mind racing. Whoever leaked this had access to the precinct. That means it's someone on the inside. Quinn nodded grimly. "Miller, maybe? Or someone working with him." Angela's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden arrival of Maria herself. She looked shaken, clutching her phone tightly in her hand. "Chief, have you seen this?" she asked, holding up the screen to show Angela the video playing on a loop. Angela nodded, gesturing for Maria to sit. "I have. They're trying to discredit both of us." Maria's voice wavered. "They're saying I'm lying, that you threatened me to say what I did. My family, they're getting messages. Threats." Angela's heart clenched at the fear in Maria's voice. She crouched down, meeting Maria's gaze directly. Listen to me. You told the truth, and the truth is on our side. This is exactly what they want, to scare you, to make you back down. But we can't let them win. Maria nodded slowly, though her hands still trembled. I'm scared, she admitted. What if they come after me? Or my kids? Angela placed a reassuring hand on Maria's. We'll protect you. I promise. You're not alone in this. Quinn stepped forward, her voice firm. Maria, we'll assign officers to watch your home. And we'll find out who's behind this video. Angela straightened, her gaze sweeping over the room. Quinn, I want a full audit of our security systems. Find out who had access to that footage and when. Martinez, double-check the evidence lockup. If they've tampered with this, they might have gone after other files too. The officers nodded, their determination renewed by Angela's unshakable resolve. As the room emptied, leaving Angela and Quinn alone, the weight of the moment settled between them. They're desperate, Quinn said after a long silence. If they're pulling stunts like this, it means they know you're winning. Angela allowed herself a small, humorless smile. Desperation makes people dangerous. We can't afford to underestimate them. Quinn hesitated, then stepped closer. Angela, you know I've got your back, but, are you okay? I mean, really? Angela exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. I don't have a choice, Quinn. I can't let them scare me. If I falter now, everything we've fought for will be for nothing. Quinn nodded, respect evident in her expression. Then let's make sure we don't falter. The hours that followed were a blur of activity. Quinn and Martinez worked tirelessly to trace the origins of the leaked video, while Angela coordinated with the few allies she could trust. Every step forward felt like pushing against a tidal wave, but Angela refused to stop. By evening, new evidence emerged, a series of financial records linking Miller to payouts from local businesses. The payments, labeled as consultation fees, were thinly veiled bribes in exchange for favors. It was the proof Angela needed to tie Miller to the corruption. When Quinn presented the findings to Angela, her expression was grim but triumphant. This is it, she said, handing Angela the files. This proves Miller's been in on this from the start. Angela studied the documents, her resolve hardening. This is what we've been waiting for. Schedule another press conference for tomorrow. We're going public with this. Quinn hesitated. Are you sure? They're already coming after you hard. This will make you their #1 target. Angela met Quinn's gaze, her voice firm. I'm already their #1 target. The only way to win is to keep moving forward. The next day, the parking lot was once again filled with reporters. Angela stood at the podium, the weight of the evidence in her hands. She began with calm precision, laying out the facts, Hayes's actions, the systemic failures that had enabled him, and now Miller's involvement. As she spoke, the crowd's murmurs grew louder. The truth was undeniable, and Angela's unwavering delivery left no room for doubt. But just as she was finishing, a commotion erupted at the back of the crowd. Angela squinted against the sunlight, her heart sinking as she recognized Miller pushing his way to the front, flanked by several officers who had clearly aligned themselves with him. This is a farce. Miller shouted, his voice carrying over the murmurs. You're destroying this department with your lies and vendettas. Angela didn't flinch. She stepped back from the podium, letting the crowd's attention shift to Miller. These so-called accusations are baseless. Miller continued, waving a stack of papers in the air. This woman doesn't care about justice. She's here to tear us apart. Angela waited for the commotion to die down before stepping forward again. Her voice was calm, deliberate. Captain Miller, if you have evidence to refute these claims, I suggest you present it now. Miller faltered, his bluster deflating slightly. I don't need evidence to see what's happening here. You're out for blood, Chief Carter. But you won't get mine. Angela's gaze didn't waver. The evidence speaks for itself. And the people of Greenwood deserve to know the truth. The crowd buzzed with tension as Miller retreated, his bravado giving way to the realization that he was cornered. Angela turned back to the reporters, her voice steady. This fight isn't just about me or this department. It's about holding those in power accountable. And I won't stop until justice is served. As the press conference ended and the crowd began to disperse, Angela felt the weight of the moment settle over her. This wasn't the end, not yet. But it was a step forward, and for now, that was enough. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of investigations, resignations, and revelations. Angela sat in her office late one evening, the precinct quieter than it had been in years. The weight of everything she had endured lingered in the air, but for the first time, there was a sense of clarity, a sense of progress. Daniel Hayes had been sentenced earlier that day. The courtroom had been packed, the air heavy with anticipation. Hayes, stripped of his badge in his former arrogance, had sat silently as the judge read the charges: attempted murder, abuse of power, and multiple counts of misconduct. His sentence was severe, a stark reminder that even those who believed themselves untouchable could be held accountable. Angela had watched from the back of the courtroom, her expression unreadable. Justice had been served, but the scars Hayes had left behind couldn't be erased. Still, as he was led away in handcuffs, she felt a flicker of hope. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one where the darkness he represented could no longer cast its shadow over Greenwood. Captain Miller's fall had been just as public, though far more chaotic. The financial records Angela and Quinn uncovered had exposed years of corruption, implicating not only Miller but several others who had conspired to maintain the status quo. Miller's protests of innocence grew weaker as the evidence mounted. Facing overwhelming pressure, he resigned in disgrace, leaving the department he had manipulated for so long. Angela had been at the forefront of the reforms that followed. She worked tirelessly to rebuild the department from the ground up, implementing new policies that emphasized accountability and transparency. Officers who resisted were replaced, and those who stayed underwent rigorous training to ensure they upheld the values Angela fought for. Maria Vasquez's bravery had not gone unnoticed. With Angela's support, she had spoken out publicly, her story inspiring others to come forward with their own experiences. Together, they had created a wave of change that swept through the community, breaking the silence that had allowed corruption to thrive. Maria found a new sense of purpose, volunteering with local organizations to help others find their voices. Her family, once targets of threats and intimidation, now stood as symbols of resilience and courage. Detective Quinn had become Angela's right hand, her unwavering support invaluable as they navigated the challenges of rebuilding. Together, they had forged a partnership rooted in trust and shared vision, their bond growing stronger with each victory. As for Angela, her journey had been anything but easy. The fight had cost her more than she could have anticipated, but it had also shown her the strength of her convictions. She had faced the worst her enemies could throw at her and emerged stronger, more determined than ever to create a department that truly served its community. Now, as she sat in her office, the faint hum of activity in the precinct reminding her of how far they had come, Angela allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. Her eyes wandered to the framed photo on her desk, a picture of her grandmother, the woman who had taught her the value of integrity and the importance of fighting for what was right. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Quinn stepped inside, a small smile on her face. "You ready? The community's waiting." Angela stood, smoothing the front of her blazer. "Let's not keep them waiting." They walked together to the precinct's front steps, where a crowd had gathered. Residents of Greenwood, young and old, stood side by side, their faces lit with hope and gratitude. Angela stepped to the podium, her heart full as she looked out at them. "This journey hasn't been easy," she began, her voice strong but warm. "But together, we've shown what's possible when we refuse to stay silent, when we stand up for what's right." Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without sacrifice. But today, we take another step forward, together. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the night. Angela stepped back, letting their voices fill the air. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. Reflecting on this story, think about the power of standing up against injustice, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Angela's journey reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting in spite of it. It's about believing in something bigger than yourself and being willing to fight for it. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What stood out to you in this story? How did it make you feel? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that challenge, inspire, and surprise. Together, we can keep these important conversations going. Thank you for being part of this journey.